If you are counting, we are now 4 Sundays into this series, this worship series on some questions we may have. At the risk of unnecessary repeat, we have followed all these weeks, framing them as questions we may have of one another in these early days and weeks of our relationship all together, and as questions that could naturally flow out of the early days and weeks for Jesus' first followers making their way after that first Easter. Trying to figure out then and now how to be faithful and brave in a complicated world. So we covered some of the 5 W's so far. We've considered who and what and when, and now we have arrived at where. At today's point of encounter with Jesus and company, we can locate them in a place of great uncertainty. At least it feels like it must have felt quite uncertain for followers who were preparing to say farewell to the visible presence of their leader. Humans of every time and place have a very tactile nature usually about us. We rely upon what we have before us to orient and to ground. Moving into the metaphysical, the remembered, the reimagined, that can take an extraordinary amount of energy and effort in every way. This past week in particular, I have been given the gifts of time and expertise, taken on a behind-the-scenes tour of the physical spaces entrusted to this congregation. Someone who shall remain nameless at his wry request and understated way, and then another who knows and cares for these buildings with equally great passion. Together they let me in on some of the core pieces that are about so much more than where we gather as a body of believers and seekers. As I've learned quickly, these are spaces of community commitment, and there is a profound trust and responsibility for us all together as stewards and servants of a vision that begins and ends with God. There is exceeding blessing and opportunity through it all. These behind-the-scenes moments, these tours, are so crucial for me for insight and context. They give shape and texture to our shared calling to brave decisions about these vast physical resources as part of a community network with community-based dreams. That insight and context also has me thinking more concretely about some plans to be elsewhere, albeit for only a short while. Dreaming with you about what is possible for here, I find myself making early plans for 2 places of retreat and study, of soul nourishment and stretching, that I might be stretched more faithfully right back here. The first place I'm looking toward is called the Capel House of Prayer. It's part of the Archdiocese of Regina. It is an ecumenical house of welcome with a mailing address in Fort Capel, Saskatchewan. And I hope to be there for a week in the mid-fall, and more on that will be revealed as early as my covenanting service next Sunday, June 5th in the afternoon. Most notably then, I will be able to introduce my friend and colleague Pat Lister, who's joining us to preach, traveling to us from Abernethy, Saskatchewan. The second place very much on my mind is much newer to my knowledge and my plans, and it's less of a place in a lot of ways than a state of being. I find myself taken in by the work and the promise of the Boundless Compassion training program offered at various sites throughout the United States. Drawing on the title of Joyce Rupp's very successful and award-winning book, subtitled Creating a Way of Life, Boundless Compassion describes itself as a program that draws from a vast and growing body of research showing the power of compassion to increase caring behaviors and restore divided groups to a common humanity. So it tries really intentionally to meld science and spirituality so that learners like me can join in retreats, workshops, events, all seeking to heighten awareness, but then also action to inspire a holistic and caring approach, they say, seeking to build critical skills toward compassion as a way of life, self-compassion, and compassion related to suffering, marginalization, and creation. So in other words, there is no place, there is no one in this world outside the need for compassion. It is boundless. From what we have witnessed in this last week alone, in the broken and grieving hearts of Uvalde, Texas, to the ever-increasing and overwhelming destruction in Ukraine, to the deep losses that are named and known in our own families and neighborhoods, there are massive storms. There are numbing levels of destruction on too many levels, and so many reasons why our hearts might be inclined to want to lift ourselves from this planet too, because sorrows can feel too heavy, too much, too inescapable otherwise, and might leave us wondering if there is any end in sight. In the midst of it all, sometimes it seems as though some of the people we would most look to in search of peace and resolution, those with both the authority and the responsibility for the greater good and the ability to bring concrete change, they can be the ones who most let us down, hiding behind faith systems and ideological bases that live far from what Jesus said and did. It is no wonder that many have given up on the language of thoughts and prayers. It can all sound very empty and hollow, with gun advocates meeting in large convention centers down the highway from grieving parents who haven't yet found or buried their children. None of it makes sense, and all of it leaves us reeling. And yet here I am, coming before you in the fresh space of new hurt, leaning hard and yet humbly into Jesus' profound belief and clearly spoken, very prayerful promise that we can still find our way through this, through these messes, through these incomprehensible tragedies, when we choose to bind ourselves in the bond of common unity. Jesus prayed and Jesus lived for all humanity, the bold awareness that divisions can bring us nowhere but farther apart. To borrow from another of Joyce Rupp's most influential writings, described by reviewer Sylvia Borstein as a multi-voiced, beautiful reassurer of the Spirit. No matter the expression that we choose to honor the divine, the eternal mystery, the love beyond all loves, we must see ourselves in the grander context, in the diversity of expression, lifting fragments of God's ancient name. We are children of a God beyond all names, whose first and last request of us all is to find a way to see the very vast space of this life, this world, with enough room and enough resources that we need not fight our way to be seen. The global community will not suddenly become a peaceable kingdom tomorrow if we gather hands today and sing in harmonized tones. We know this. But something, somewhere, we must also know will start to give toward wholeness each and every time we stand and we speak against exclusion. And so, as tempting as it may be to run away from the institutional expression of following Jesus, especially when some public faces of this faith spew such harmful rhetoric, fueling acts that are born of illness or hatred and more, there are voices like the inimitable Brian McLaren who call us back to the holy ground from which we can make change together. As summarized by the equally inimitable Richard Rohr in this past Tuesday's daily meditation, Over the decades, Brian McLaren has had many conversations with faithful Christians who are also disillusioned by church and religion. After one evening spent in the company of 2 Roman Catholic sisters who have stayed in service to the church for over 50 years, McLaren reflects, "There are more than 2 options, I thought. I don't have to choose between staying Christian compliantly or leaving Christianity defiantly. I can stay defiantly, just like Sister Anne and Sister Jean, not their real names. I can intentionally, consciously, resolutely refuse to leave. And with equal intention and resolution, I can refuse to comply with the status quo. I can occupy Christianity with a different way of being Christian." When I say stay defiantly, I don't mean ungraciously. Sisters Anne and Jean radiate such gentleness and inner calm that accusations of being ungracious simply don't stick. No, with firm yet gracious defiance, they will keep speaking their truths and will continue doing so from the inside as long as they can. Richard Rohr continues, saying McLaren finds encouragement to remain a committed Christian in Jesus' own decision to stay and wrestle with his Jewish faith, even as he was rejected. McLaren says, "I can no longer put a naive trust in the structures of the Christian religion, seeing and knowing what I see and know now, but instead of rejecting my religious community, I remain paradoxically present to it, neither minimizing its faults nor hating it for its faults." Jesus, of course, counted this cost. He stayed out loud. And it's worth noting where his staying led him, not to winning, not to success. It led him to the utter defeat and humiliation of the cross. Was he a fool to keep faith through his dying breath, to translate his feeling of forsakenness into a prayer? Was he a fool to think that the legacy of the prophets, the legacy of his cousin John, and the legacy of his mother Mary were worth staying for, to save that legacy from corruption by the religious gatekeepers of his day? Was he a fool to stay in the fray with the religious company men of his day, naming their corruption and toxicity with carefully chosen words like whitewashed sepulchres and brood of vipers? Would he have been wiser to leave quietly for India and become Hindu, or to go quietly to China and become Buddhist instead of challenging the status quo of his own religion? Was he a fool to think that the tiny handful of people who got only a tiny sliver of his message and saw some faint glimmer of what he saw could outlive him and do greater things than he had done? Are you willing to be that kind of fool? Am I? Today, at least, inspired by the example of Sister Jean and Sister Anne, I am. To us all, Jesus has revealed God's beautiful name of love, mercy, incomparable and unconditional embrace. To us all, Jesus continues to reveal it in the living legacy of acceptance and compassion, all so that the love Jesus knew and lived can live and breathe in us. We are here on this holy ground in the place of ongoing revelation. God knows we are in need of this community. We are seekers of common unity, and by God's enduring grace, we are empowered and we are sent in the brave belief that we shall come into that fullness all together. To God alone be the glory. Amen.